He specializes in integrating psychological, multicultural, and evidence-based principles to enhance team performance and effectiveness. His research interests involve PTSD, and substance abuse, clinical health psychology, and the analysis of social forces affecting racial ethnic minorities. He has conducted talks and trainings at both national and international levels, has been published in various peer-reviewed journals, and has served as a graduate level instructor. As the founder and chief executive officer of R.C. Warren Consulting, Dr. Warner utilizes a tailored and interactive approach to accelerate change within small and large organizations around the globe. I'm excited again and privileged to turn it over and hand the baton to Dr. Warner. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much. Let me just work on making sure I share my screen correctly. I can start there. Let's see.
And I think you're the host now, so hopefully it works.
Okay, can you see this screen okay now?
Great, thank you.
Okay, can you see the whole slide now?
Now we see your presenter view slides.
Oh, okay.
So if you want to do presenter, that's the view. It has the one slide at a time right there. That's great that you had it. If you want to have your presenter view, we can work through that too.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
The profundity of sharing in the virtual space.
Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's great. We can see that.
Okay, so I would like to first start by saying I really appreciate the opportunity to join this group. So today I'm going to talk about enhancing psychological resilience and reducing barriers within Black communities. I really want to note that this can be an interactive presentation. So if you all want to unmute your microphones throughout, if you would like to also turn on your cameras, I really want to hear from the experiences of you all, because there's a lot of great experts in this room as well. So as you all know, the Chronic Disease Prevention Council is a multidisciplinary body of experts seeking to reduce chronic disease in New Mexico. So when we talk about different chronic diseases, you know, we talked about tobacco, we talked about heart disease, stroke, etc. It's really important to note that mental health as well must be in that conversation, just because of the comorbidity between chronic illness and mental wellness. So today we're going to talk a little bit more detail about how can we be able to reduce the barriers specifically within the Black community, within the various work that we all do. Quick disclaimer, so it's really important to note that statements of fact and opinion are expressed of those of the presenter or myself and are not the opinion or position of any other represented entity. So these are some objectives that we're going to review throughout, and it's important to note that the Black community suffers from increased rates of mental health concerns like anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, etc. However, it's important to note that research shows that individuals who experience mental health challenges also are at higher likelihood to developing chronic illnesses. So that's why today we're going to talk about the comorbidities of mental disorder and chronic diseases. We're going to identify behavioral health barriers that Black communities may face. And we're also going to list strategies to figure out how can we mitigate stress and enhance well-being among this population. So I'd like to start by saying, when faced with failure, adversity, or disappointment, we all know the phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And this concept refers to resilience. Resilience can be developed throughout learning different strategies and coping skills. However, it's important to know that some populations have no choice but to be resilient. And we look at specifically the Black community and individuals of color. They experience a disproportionate amount of discrimination, systemic barriers compared to other groups. For instance, if we just start, let's look at the history of the Black population. I'm not going to go into a full history lesson, but we all know that the Black community has went through Jim Crow, slavery, the new Jim Crow, post-civil rights era, etc. And we look at today, in today's society, For instance, COVID-19, we know that individuals who identify as a person of color are disproportionately impacted by the COVID vaccine, the COVID-19 as well. We know this population experiences a significant amount of additional stressors, lack of housing resources, a lot of violence in their communities, economic disparities, et cetera. So with that accumulation of all these additional stressors and systemic barriers, we must understand that this population has still found a way to persevere and push through these different circumstances. And with that, today we're going to focus on resiliency. We're going to talk about what resiliency means, and we're going to talk about the importance of being able to promote resiliency in the work that we do. So let's start off by explaining, what does resiliency mean? So resiliency is defined as the psychological process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. So when thinking about resiliency, we have to understand that generations can also push forward resiliency throughout our different generations. For instance, so me as an African-American male, I actually recently had a conversation with my grandfather, and he's 91 years old. And he told me about all this different challenges he went through in his life, the discrimination, the racism, not having the proper resources, but he's been able to press through and persevere, to be able to raise 11 children, really to raise my father. And my father took those things and passed it up to my generation. And myself, I actually just had my first child 12 days ago. And as myself, as an African-American raising another African-American male, I've learned through my ancestors about how we can persevere and push through and promote resiliency in our population. And resiliency is also essential in the work that we do as healthcare providers. I saw that in the chat box, there's a lot of social workers, there's case managers, there may be therapists in the group as well. And myself as a psychologist, I think about, how can I promote resilience, not only in the patients that I see every day, but how can I join groups like this? How can I be able to spread resiliency through the research that I conduct, through the community outreach that I engage in as well? And this group is a phenomenal group because you all are promoting resilience and trying to figure out how can you prevent chronic illnesses throughout the state of New Mexico and throughout the community. And that's why today resiliency is so important to focus on. So when talking about mental health and mental wellness, it's a question that comes to mind, I always think about is, so why does mental illness and chronic physical conditions coexist? And I think the first step to understanding this co-occurrence is looking at first the biopsychosocial model. So let's type in the chat box. Have you all heard of the biopsychosocial model before? You just type in yes or no in the chat box. Okay, so we see some mixed responses. A lot of individuals have heard of the biopsychosocial model. So the biopsychosocial model looks at the intersection between the physiological state, the biological influences, as well as the social, environmental, and the psychological influences as well. So, so when looking at biological impacts, when we're looking at chronic disease, it's really important to indicate that we should look multifacetedly, right? So you all talked about tobacco, right? Your usage. You all talked about cancer and stroke. And this group focuses a lot on those diseases, but we have to look multifacetedly as well. We have to look at, so what are the social and environmental factors that may be influencing these chronic diseases to progress in our communities? Well, what about the psychological influences as well? And if we look on this slide, we see that the social skills that individuals have, the coping strategies as well, and as well as the environment that they live in, the culture they identify with, as well as the biological influences, right? If we look at the genetic vulnerability and the emotions that individuals hold, et cetera, all of this comes together to influence if an individual is going to be adaptive and persevere through, or if they may have a more challenging time overcoming some of the challenges and diseases that they face. So for instance, research shows that individuals who experience hypertension, if they're able to better manage that, if they are highly resilient, if they have the psychological coping strategies to be able to cope with that stressor, right? We also know that individuals who experience chronic pain, if they're more sensitive to stress if they experience depression or anxiety, et cetera, right? So that's the importance of looking at these holistically when looking at chronic physical conditions as well as mental health. So let's look now at statistics. So looking at the slide right now, we know that although anyone can develop mental health problems, Black Americans sometimes experience more severe forms of serious mental health challenges. For instance, according to research, we know that 20% of Black Americans are 20% more likely to experience severe mental health challenges compared to other populations. We also know that Blacks had significantly elevated rates of comorbidities compared with whites. So looking at some of these other statistics, for instance, the last one really stands out to me, that Black individuals with diabetes are more likely to develop depression and risk factors for diabetes compared to other groups. And individuals who identify as Black who have cancer, we know that they also experience anxiety and depression as well. So looking at some of these statistics, do these stand out to you? Are you all aware of these statistics, these healthcare disparities that we see in this population? You can unmute your microphone or you can type in the chat box. Okay, so it seems like some mixed response, but most individuals are familiar with these disparities that we see.
Ryan, I think it's really important that you're mentioning the connections between chronic disease and mental wellness. I just appreciate you lifting those out and the disparities that exist in that area as well.
Definitely, thank you. So I've actually conducted a lot of research on hypertension. And when looking at that particular group, specifically minorities who have hypertension, we know that if we look at the Black community, there are additional barriers that this community faces when it comes to mental health. And that ultimately may exacerbate some of their hypertension challenges as well. For instance, if we're going to talk about some barriers moving forward in this group, but I want to hear from you all right now. I want to engage in some more discussion because we have a lot of experts in the virtual room right now. And I want to hear from you, what mental health barriers are you aware of within the Black community that may ultimately lead to chronic diseases? And if someone feels comfortable, please unmute your microphone because I want to engage in verbal discussion as well, if feasible.
Well, I think that one of the larger barriers may be misunderstanding of what mental health care represents and stigma around mental health care. Yeah, Alberta Davis just took my answer, so there. Very good. But yeah, definitely stigma, which is something that's universal. I also, at our clinic, our emphasis is on cultural competence so that we don't alienate someone in mental health care or seeking mental health care by not operating in ways that are culturally informed. And so sometimes that can represent a barrier as well.
Okay, yeah, definitely. We also say, Mary said provider issues. Maybe can you elaborate please on that, Mary?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you know, I'm going to relate it to a story when I worked as a school counselor at one point in my career, and I had some Black girls that came into me and said, the teachers, they don't understand us. They don't understand, you know, and I knew exactly what she was talking about because these girls, you know, they were really close to their moms. They were kind of some of our kids that came, a few of them were kids that came from New Orleans with the Hurricane Katrina. And, you know, just how they interacted and their voices were a little louder. And this little girl was in tears. She was a 7th grade girl about having to fit within certain norms that were not, I don't know if I'm making sense by explaining that were not, you know, culturally acceptable in her world, you know, and when she brought her world over to the school world, she was, you know, felt really put down for it, not accepted. So I think, you know, I think that we really say we understand, but, you know, on even on racist stuff, but I don't think people really do, you know, in a lot of ways. So, you know, I think that there, you know, we live in this kind of certain expectations, and if you're a little different than that, you know, we have to be careful, even as when somebody said culturally competent, as culturally competent therapists, workers, CHWs, social workers, you know, I'm a therapist, that we are aware, we accept that person where they're at and take in their whole cultural instead of trying to fit them in the mold, which the schools often do.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a phenomenal example. And I really appreciate you elaborating on that. And I know we have a very diverse group. So we're going to give some examples about, like, if you do clinical care, you know, how that would look, but also maybe if you do research or maybe just involved, you know, in this group today, you know, we're going to talk about some ways that we can all contribute to maybe reduce some of those barriers. But that's definitely great. And I definitely, I see that same thing as well in my clinical work that I do. So we also have some great responses in the chat box. You know, Kenneth talked about racism as a primary factor of mental risk as well. We have Gail that talked about the stigma, the sign of weakness, definitely.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, you know, sometimes we have to make sure that we make the distinction that the only reason that being Black correlates to mental health risk is because of how the dominant society reacts to us being Black, not necessarily that Blackness comes with mental illness. I think that's important to note, that culture is a group's response to their environment. So that culture is whole, but the primary indicator of mental health risk for us seems to be the trauma of how we're treated as Black people. There we go, Trish, thank you. And then also a lack of access to environments that support wellness, not just healthcare. So we're talking about neighborhoods and you know, places where food is readily available, places where housing is appropriate and safe. Those are all factors before you even get to whether or not you need a therapist.
Definitely. And I think that goes directly into our next slide that we have. So let's watch a quick video. You should be able to hear it, but let me know if you cannot hear this video.
There are few groups who could stand to benefit from therapy more than Black people. I mean, think about all the things Black people have been through: slavery, segregation, winter, all equally traumatic experiences. But unfortunately, even as therapy has become more mainstream, the Black community has had a tough time getting the help that they need.
It's hard enough to get mental health treatment in the U.S., but studies show that racial and ethnic minorities are significantly less likely to receive mental health treatment than whites.
Black and Hispanic children are less likely to get mental health care than white kids. And studies show that irritability in the average white teenager is often labeled as depression. That same behavior is more likely to be seen as disruptive in Black or Latino children, and doctors say that can lead to feelings of hopelessness at a very young age.
Yes, one of the reasons many Black people don't get the proper treatment is misdiagnosis. What is seen as depression in white people can be seen as disruptive behavior in Black people. And this shouldn't be surprising, right? This kind of thing happens in medicine all the time, mixed diagnoses. It's like when a Black person has a seizure, it's a medical emergency. But when a white person does it, it's called dancing. But it turns out, even when Black people are properly diagnosed with mental health issues, it can still be a challenge to find a therapist who's equipped to handle their needs.
Making the crisis worse, not enough African American therapists. Today, only 4% of psychologists are Black.
Kevin Durden says admitting he needed help was actually easier than finding it. He saw 3 different therapists, but felt that none of them understood the stress and emotions unique to Black men.
When Taraji P. Henson's own son Marcel was struggling, she found it nearly impossible to find him one.
Trying to find a culturally competent therapist was like looking for a purple unicorn with a gold horn.
Do they understand the cultural context from which I'm coming from? Do they understand the culture that I live in?
That's right. It's extremely difficult for Black people to find a Black therapist. And it's been like this for a very, very long time. I mean, that's why Martin Luther King Jr. was always describing his dreams to huge crowds. You know, it's just like, I had another dream that I'm being chased by bears in my underwear. Does anyone here know what that means? Now you may think that a therapist's race shouldn't matter at all. And that's true. But if you think about it, it does make sense. For many white therapists, no matter how good they are, it can be hard to understand the particular experiences of a Black person. You know, just sitting there in a session, even if they're trying, it could be like, so you say people are following you around the store and you're invisible, but only to taxi drivers? Paranoid delusions. So when it comes to mental health, there's a very real struggle for Black people to access healthcare, get diagnosed correctly, and find a therapist who can relate to them. But if that wasn't bad enough, there's another major hurdle stopping Black people from getting therapy, and it comes from the Black community itself.
We have a stigma in the Black community when it comes to dealing with mental health.
Black students say where they come from, it's shameful to talk about anxiety, depression, and trauma.
It's not okay to have mental health issues, or like, that's a white people thing.
I've heard all the time, Black men don't go to therapy, they go to the barbershop. I told my own mother that I was seeing a therapist, and she said, you don't need to see a therapist. What you need to do is see a preacher.
You got Jesus.
Right.
You don't need anything else,
Right.
you know, just buck it up.
Ah, yeah. That's a line every Black person knows all too well. You don't need therapy, you need Jesus. And my response is always, why can't we use both? Because church is a great place for community, but therapy is great for one-on-one mental health needs. I mean, I bet Jesus himself wish he could have gone to therapy at times, you know? Just be like, so my best friend betrayed me, and I was born in a freaking barn, plus my birthday always falls on Christmas, so I only get one set of presents. It's so shitty.
Kids. And studies show that
there are few.
So I want to hear your thoughts about that. I know most people could have heard that video. They were able to hear that video, but I know one person couldn't. But what are some initial reactions? Would anybody like to unmute their microphone and tell me more?
Well, I think it goes to the oversimplification of healthcare needs for people who come from cultures that might not be represented in mass media. You know, we think we can slap a Band-Aid on it. Unfortunately, there aren't enough therapists for all the people in the country who need a therapist, and let alone enough Black therapists for all the Black people who need a therapist. So in the meantime, while we try to grow Black therapists, what we would hope is that all therapists become culturally competent enough to stand in compassion and provide culturally resonant care for whomever they encounter, because our skills are precious to our whole community, not the least of which us as individuals, as Black people, or maybe as women, or as our own groups as providers, but the mental health care profession is in desperate need of more hands.
Definitely. Anybody else have any reactions to that video?
Hi, this is Gail. I want to follow up on what Kenneth is talking about. One thing I notice is just the discomfort, because there is difference between a white person and a Black person just trying to get comfortable in that relationship. And again, it could be because of racism, also, you know, different cultural norms. So, and then on top of it, not having a reasonable or, you know, helpful number of therapists just compounds the issue.
Definitely. Yeah, so you all are right on track. And right now we're going to go more into the barriers that Black individuals may experience. And some of you all already touched on this. So in the video, it gave a great point about the familial shame around mental health. And as a psychologist, when I see patients on a daily basis, especially patients of color, I've had a lot of individuals come to me and they say, you know, Dr. Warner, I really don't feel comfortable talking about these things and being emotionally vulnerable because my parents taught me and my parents' parents taught them that we need to suck it up. We need to be able to just push through, and we've been able to persevere throughout different challenges in the past, and we can persevere now, and we don't need to talk to a professional. We don't need to express our emotions. And ultimately that avoidance in the Black community has been normalized, and being able to push it down, just press through. You know, in the short term, we know avoidance can be helpful sometimes, but in the long term, avoidance is actually maladaptive to our overall well-being. And ultimately, when we look at other aspects of diversity and identity, right? We think about the male perspective, right? So we know that men of color are actually they experience, you know, very similar mental health challenges. However, they do not seek mental health care at the same rate as individuals of color who identify as female, right? So we look at the masculinity piece and we layer that on top of the familial shame around mental health, right? And then we layer that on top of the economic and social barriers that this population may experience, et cetera. And ultimately, this just creates more difficulty when trying to seek mental health treatment. So that's one barrier that I've seen just in my daily work, and also the research has continued to display as well. And we also think about the cultural stigma of mental illness. So we know that in general, there's a huge stigma around mental health, right? And we've talked about this before. But individuals who identify as person of color or identify as Black or African American, there may be additional stigma as well. Because as we talked about previously, there may not be a lot of providers, right, who identify as a person of color. And ultimately, they may feel like, oh, that's what the white people do. You know, that's a white person thing to go to a clinician or go to a professional to seek mental health support, right? So that cultural stigma, that shame behind it, has continued to be reinforced throughout time. And this goes directly into the lack of diversity in healthcare as well. We know that only about 2% of individuals identify as Black and identify as a healthcare provider, right? So psychologists, social workers, et cetera. So with that lack of diversity, once again, individuals may not feel comfortable. And also research shows that there may be a poor competency among non-Black clinicians. So I want to add as well, I want to put researchers as well, because so in my work, I do a lot of work when it comes to hypertension, PTSD, substance use, et cetera. And when going throughout the literature and we look at the demographic section, 9 times out of 10, I see a majority, maybe 70 to 80% Caucasian population that the study was comprised of. So when we look at the data from these the different research studies, and it's a majority white group that they did the study on, and we say, okay, well, this particular intervention works for PTSD and comorbid substance use, but who does it work for? Does it just work for the white population? Does it work for, you know, the Black population or Hispanic population, et cetera? Right. So when we look at the literature as well, we need to also take into the consideration cultural factors that may influence the data that we see. Okay. And also in a clinical setting, you know, individuals who identify as the majority population may not be aware of a lot of these disparities that we see as well. So for instance, I've seen in my daily work, when working with some of my colleagues, individuals may feel like, oh, this person is avoiding therapy. They don't want to see me. They have no-showed all their appointments. But what about the different factors that may influence why they no-show? For instance, do they have access to transportation to get to their appointments on time, right? Do they have, maybe they're a single parent and maybe they couldn't find childcare and they couldn't make their appointment that day. Or maybe they don't feel comfortable because they identify as Black and maybe this other person identifies as white and maybe they don't feel heard, right? Well, there are different perspectives that we have to take in consideration as well. And lastly, whiteness as a foundation to mental health care. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the literature historically is focused on the majority population. And we also look at the DSM. The DSM is ultimately used as the foundation of all providers. So that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And ultimately with that, when that was created, and there's different revisions now we're in the fifth revision. However, this manual may not take in consideration a lot of cultural factors that may influence mental health symptomology, right? So we have to look at what foundation are we being taught as well in our clinical work. So a lot of individuals here in the group, you know, like I said, our case managers, social workers, therapists, et cetera. So think about when you were in school, you know, did you have a class about, you know, racial diversity in healthcare? You know, when you were taught about the chronic diseases, did you also learn about how that influences disproportionately, you know, individuals of color, you know, et cetera. So we have to think about the foundation that we've been taught and also the foundation that, you know, is in the media, mainstream media. And we have to think about, is that using cultural competence, you know, in the work that we do as well. So what can we do? I know we have about maybe 13 minutes left. And it's really important today that we not only talk about the barriers that this population may face, but we also talk about how can we contribute to reducing these healthcare disparities and enhancing resilience within this population. So on a community or societal level, here are a couple ideas on the slide. So the first thing that comes to mind is culturally tailoring messages, okay? So when I think about this particular group, I want to think about how are you all, for instance, how are you distributing the information that you have? For instance, if you have a Twitter or if there's a social media following, you know, who follows that page? You know, is it majority individuals who identify as person of color, or is it, you know, majority individuals who are part of the majority population, right? So the messages that we're putting out there in the community, are they tailored to underserved groups, right? So underserved groups may not have access to a lot of this phenomenal information and interventions that different groups are putting forth. It's really important that we go into these communities and that we also collaborate with and create partners with other leaders and institutions that have the population and audience that we're trying to get our message across to, right? So for instance, partnering with HBCUs, partnering with historically Black fraternities and sororities, you know, going into underserved, marginalized communities, you know, et cetera, to convey the different information, you know, is really important as well. Also, when we think about diversifying, you know, diversifying the healthcare workforce, that's also essential as well. So earlier, when we first began the introduction to this group today, we talked about how the committees are increasingly becoming a little bit more diverse. So we're finding more representation, particularly in this specific group, right? So we have to think about how can we continue to diversify and obtain the perspectives of different groups. Because if we only have one perspective, if we notice that maybe everyone on our committee is of the same background, then we're not going to have the different ideas, and we're not going to have different perspectives to really accelerate our organization, right? So that's really important as well. So dismantling racism, that's a huge thing, right? That can be extremely challenging, but we have to think about individually, what are some things that we may do unconsciously that may perpetuate, you know, racism or structural barriers? You know, for instance, if we work in a specific community agency and we notice that individuals of color are not getting the same treatment, are we stepping up and are we saying something about that? Are we bringing that to HR? Are we bringing that to our supervisors and our leaders? What are we doing to make it change? Because it's really important to know that everyone on this call can do something very small, and we can take a step so we can be able to enhance resiliency in this population and decrease these racial disparities that we see. I often say the quote, "Silence is compliance and only enhances and encourages injustice in the world." So if we see something that's not right, whether that be a structural policy, whether that be a group that is not diversified, whether that be the work that we do every day, if we notice a population is not being adequately supported, then we have to step up and we have to say something. We have to figure out what can we do to make a small change to ultimately change that system in place. Any thoughts before I continue? I want to leave it open right now to hear the feedback from you all. So, see in the chat box, you all saying some really great things.
So Ryan, this is Kate, Mary Kate, or Kate, I go by again. And hi, you know, that is such a huge question that, you know, you asked, and and finding a place to start is kind of what I heard, you know. I think I would probably go with putting dismantling racism, which is probably huge, to up top, you know, as far as, you know, I just kind of will share that, you know, when I was back in the 80s, I was a single mom, and I used to say, look at this, like white men on top, and then Black and Hispanic men, then women, and then single moms. And I used to say the harder thing of being a single mom would be if I was Black or Hispanic, you know, right now, because I had felt that discrimination at that time, you know, about being a single mom. So I mean, it kind of, you know, I felt bad for my other female partners that were Black and Hispanic, because I knew that it was even harder on them. So I think all of these things, you know, on the social community level are so important. You know, culturally tailoring the messages just on the vaccine alone, or, you know, being open to allowing, you know, or not, like when I had a friend of mine who's a Black male said that he has been pulled over, he's a big guy, you know, professional, pulled over 8 times by the police just because he was a Black male. And just to, you know, and how that, so until, you know, how would somebody feel safe going to a counselor or a therapist or a healthcare worker if those, you know, those experiences are so prominent in their lives? Mm-hmm. Like, definitely. How do you open up to somebody on your deep, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, you all are making some really great points. You know, the only unfortunate thing about today is we don't have enough time to go into this more, because it's a huge, you know, significant topic. I know Gail talked about a great point as well, saying that, you know, we should be sincere and intentional in diversity, you know, not just jumping the bandwagon. And yeah, I've seen that historically. I've seen organizations, you know, when George Floyd, you know, died in the hands of police, and everybody said, hey, we need diversity training. We need to talk more about this. But these things have been happening way before that, right? And we just look at the statistics, we look at the literature as well, that these are ongoing systemic challenges. And we should not just talk about diversity when it's convenient. This should be intentional in everything that we do. Because we know that when we have more diverse perspectives and we put diversity at the forefront of the work that we do, then ultimately we're able to enhance our performance, we're able to achieve the outcomes that we look towards, and we're able to accomplish the goals at hand as well. A little bit better when we think about how diverse groups can help our organization, help our agency, and just be able to improve that over time. But yeah, diversity is a huge topic today. We only touched on the tip of the surface, but you all are making great points as well about this. So these are some ideas about on a societal community level. And with that, I also want to talk about on an individual level, what can we do to enhance resiliency among this population, okay? So this is what I call the 4 M's of mental wellness. So if we're able to implement these 4 M's of mental wellness, whether if you're a provider, maybe you can convey this to the patients that you work with, or maybe you have a friend or you have family members in which they're experiencing chronic diseases and they're really having a hard time coping. You know, we know that chronic illness obviously contributes to mental health challenges. And these are 4 tips in which we can implement, and we can also teach others in which they can implement in their daily life to just improve their resilience and enhance their well-being, okay? So the first M of the 4 M's of mental wellness is mindfulness, okay? So if we're able to be mindful in the moment, if we're able to display gratitude, if we're able to just understand how can we be present during the here and now, then ultimately research shows that that's actually gonna help us improve our ability to cope with different stressors. So for instance, research shows that if you implement 10 minutes of mindfulness each day, that actually enhances our ability to cope with chronic pain a little bit better, right? And if we have hypertension, that actually helps our blood pressure get a little bit more under control and helps us be in a better psychological state to manage our chronic illness. You know, so it's really important to know, today we're not gonna go all into detail about what mindfulness is and how you can implement it. But if you're being more mindful in the moment and more present, display more gratitude, think about what is going well in our life right now. Right now, everyone is experiencing COVID right now. Everyone may be away from their family, may be isolated, you know, and being able to figure out, hey, yes, there are some challenges in our life, but also if we could be thankful for the things that are going well, that can improve our resilience. The next thing that we can do to improve our mental wellness is engaging in mastery. So when I think of mastery, I think about focusing on the activities and the things that you do well. So a lot of individuals, especially when they experience chronic pain, or if they have a disability, they have loss of their extremities, etc. Ultimately, they feel that they cannot engage in activities that gave them pleasure in the past. However, if we're able to reinforce the idea that if we're focusing on things that bring us joy, whether that be doing a crossword puzzle or focusing on a skill or a hobby, you know, that brings us some joy, then ultimately that's going to improve our mental wellness as well, okay? So engaging in mastery is essential. Next, meaningful connection is very important when improving our resilience and improving our mental wellness, okay? So we know that if we're able to reach out to others, if we're able to support others who may be experiencing chronic diseases or different stressors or challenges in their life, then that's going to improve our ability to push through and persevere. So meaningful connection and meaningful engagement can look different in everybody's life. So as an organization, you know, maybe we could figure out how can we connect better with individuals who experience chronic diseases. You know, can we connect with them on social media? Can we send them different resources to their homes, you know, in the mail or something like that, to connect with them a little bit better? You know, whatever that is that looks like for you or the organization, it's important to reflect on that a little bit more, because that can also improve our resiliency as well. And lastly, movement is essential. So similar to our physical health, our mental health must be exercised. Okay, so I'll say that again. Similar to our physical health, our mental health must be exercised. So I mentioned before, the comorbidity between chronic disease and mental wellness is really important to be aware of, because when we learn about, for instance, we'll think about like hypertension. You know, we have to eat healthy, right? We have to ensure that we walk maybe at least 10 minutes a day, right? We have to ensure that we're mitigating our stress levels, etc. We have to do something, okay, to mitigate the impact of that chronic disease on our overall well-being. So with that, if we want to enhance our resilience, we have to do something as well. We have to engage in mindfulness. We have to do things that we enjoy, engage in mastery. We have to try to reach out to others when we feel we need additional support, right? Whether that be a professional support or reaching out to a friend or family member, etc. Right? So it's really important to know that we have to move, we have to do something. And also as an organization, if we want to make change, if we want to be able to mitigate the impact that chronic disease has on the community, then we need to engage in different action items like we're doing today. We need to figure out, going back to this slide, how can we on a community and societal level, how can we mitigate these healthcare disparities? What can we do as an organization to ensure that individuals are getting the resources that they need so they can thrive in their life and not just have to just manage, right? So that's really important as well. So mindfulness, mastery, meaningful connection, and movement. In summary, our objectives, let's see if we went over all our objectives. So number one, we describe comorbidities of mental disorders and chronic diseases. We identified the mental health barriers that Black communities may face. And we also obtained strategies for mitigating stress and enhancing well-being. It's really important to know, I'm gonna go back to this slide because I think it's so important, that some of these may feel like very significant tasks to accomplish. However, we can all make one small little step in our community, in our organization that we work in, et cetera, to be a game changer and to be a difference maker, you know, in the society that we live in, right? So it's really important to know and maybe reflect on, maybe we have some time as well in our breakout groups to figure out what are some small steps that we can all take to contribute to making a change, you know, in this ongoing issue. So review our objectives today. And also, I would like to say I really enjoyed this presentation and engaging with you all. You know, I'm really inspired by all the work that you all do and the community and societal change that you're making. And this is, we only touched on the tip of the surface today. So we know that there are barriers that, you know, marginalized groups may face, specifically Black communities. We reviewed the fact that, hey, there are some ways though we can all make a small little step to make a difference, right? And now maybe after this presentation, we can start to brainstorm specifically, you know, what we can do to get more involved, okay? So take a screenshot of this, you know, take a picture. Here's my contact information. I really appreciate your feedback and learning about how this experience was for you. And also I want to provide some additional resources. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to put some resources in the chat box. So the first resource is a peer-reviewed article about reducing racial inequities in healthcare, okay? So they have a lot of great ideas in which maybe we can think about how we can implement. So that's a good resource. The second resource is to learn more about the 4 M's. So this is a Psychology Today blog that I recently wrote, and you can learn more about the 4 M's and how that pertains to the Black community. And then lastly is a survey. I would really appreciate if everyone could take just maybe a minute out their time, you know, after this to provide some feedback of how this presentation went for you. Okay, so those are the 3 resources. And I'm sorry, I wasn't able to go through all of the comments, but I really appreciate the engagement throughout. So that's all I have today. John, I don't know if you had any additional remarks, but I really appreciate the time. This is really fun. And hopefully I can come back again in the future to talk more about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. I know that Laurel has some things to ask or add. I do want to just open it up to questions for you, if you don't mind, from anyone in the group if they have questions for you at this point. I'll also look in the chat for those as well.
And Ryan, if you could assign me to be host again. And